Imagine standing inside a stone corridor just before dawn. The air is cold, carrying that particular stillness that exists only in places very old and very dark. Then slowly, a blade of light cuts through a narrow opening above the entrance and begins to travel across the floor. It crosses carved spirals, ancient cup marks, symbols that no living person can fully read. It reaches the back wall, and then it stops. Every year, on the same morning, it does exactly this. The people who built this place engineered that moment with extraordinary precision. They aligned a massive stone passage to the rising sun on the shortest day of the year, 5,000 years before anyone wrote down a single word about why. And here is the problem. We have no idea what it meant to them. That is not a small admission. That is not a footnote in an otherwise complete story. It is the central, unresolved fact sitting at the heart of some of the most impressive construction projects in all of human prehistory. Historians have studied these monuments for centuries. Archaeologists have excavated around them, beneath them, and in a few cases inside them. Scientists have dated their stones, scanned their surfaces with lasers accurate to fractions of a millimetre, and extracted ancient DNA from the bones of people buried nearby. The result is a picture that grows sharper in some ways and no clearer in the ways that matter most. We know more and more about the how. The why remains stubbornly out of reach. Take the engineering alone. The Dolmen of Menga in southern Spain, built roughly 6,000 years ago, has a capstone that weighs approximately 150 tons. Recent laser scanning of its surfaces reveals that the stone was fitted with millimetre-scale precision, moved into position using wooden tracks, counterweights, and ramps by people who left no written record of their methods, no blueprint, no instruction. The precision is not accidental. Whoever these builders were, they understood load distribution, leverage, and structural balance at a level that, even today, commands genuine respect from engineers. Yet the cultural purpose of what they built, the meaning behind that specific form, that specific orientation, that specific location, remains a matter of competing guesses. Or consider Carnac in northwestern France, where more than 3,000 standing stones stretch across roughly 10 kilometres of the Breton countryside. They were erected somewhere between 4,600 and 4,300 BCE, which places them firmly in the Neolithic period and makes them among the oldest large-scale megalithic works in the world. 3,000 stones, aligned in rows, over 10 kilometres. The organisational effort required to quarry, transport and erect them on that scale, across that distance, staggers the imagination. Current hypotheses range from territorial markers to astronomical observatories to processional routes tied to seasonal ceremonies. None of these explanations has moved from theory to consensus. The stones stand in their rows and offer nothing to confirm or deny any of them. This pattern of massive engineering paired with missing cultural explanation is not limited to one region or one tradition. It spans a continent, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the islands of Malta in the Mediterranean, from the wind-swept Outer Hebrides of Scotland to the fertile river valleys of Ireland. Neolithic communities separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometres were doing something remarkably similar. They were quarrying enormous stones, moving them over difficult terrain, and assembling them into structures that clearly mattered enormously to the people who built them. The labour investment alone tells you that. No community commits generations of work to something trivial. Ancient DNA analysis, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, offers a tantalising glimpse into who these builders might have been. Genetic material recovered from 27 individuals buried in 5 megalithic tombs along the Atlantic coast shows that these were patrilineal kin groups, families connected through the male line, and that a shared genetic signature links communities in Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia. These were not isolated populations independently arriving at the same ideas. There was connection, contact, some form of shared cultural network stretching across the Atlantic facade of Europe. But the DNA tells us about kinship structure. It says almost nothing about belief, symbolism, or the specific meanings attached to individual monuments. The people are becoming slightly less anonymous. The monuments remain almost entirely silent about their purpose. Modern tools continue to sharpen the picture around the edges. Bayesian radiocarbon modelling is tightening chronologies, allowing researchers to place certain construction phases within windows of decades rather than centuries. Three-dimensional laser scanning is capturing surface details that the naked eye cannot process, revealing tool marks, geometric precision, and spatial relationships between stones that were invisible before. A three-dimensionally printed model of Stonehenge, built from laser scan data, revealed that the arrangement of its stones creates unusual acoustic properties, a kind of enclosed sound environment within the circle. That is genuinely interesting. It is not, however, an explanation. It describes a consequence of the design without telling us whether that consequence was intentional, incidental, or whether sound played any role in whatever the monument was used for. Every new tool gives us a better description of what these places are. None of them has yet told us what these places meant. The uncertainty here is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs deeper than a simple lack of evidence. Even the evidence we have tends to generate more competing interpretations rather than fewer. Astronomical alignments are real at several of these sites. Newgrange is oriented to the winter solstice sunrise. Callanish in Scotland has been associated with lunar cycles. Stonehenge's famous solstice alignment is well documented, but knowing that a monument tracks the sun or the moon does not tell you why. Was it a calendar for agricultural timing? A ritual stage for seasonal ceremonies? A marker of cosmic order integrated into a belief system we cannot reconstruct? A territorial declaration linking a community to the sky above their land? All of these explanations are possible. Evidence conclusively supporting any one of them over the others does not yet exist. Chronologies too carry their own uncertainties. Radiocarbon dates can shift by centuries depending on sample selection and calibration methods, which means the apparent simultaneity of building phases across different sites may or may not reflect actual contemporaneous activity. What looks like a pan-European movement in one calibration might look more fragmented in another. The connections are real in some form. The precision of those connections remains genuinely unclear. What we are left with is a tension that no amount of new data has yet resolved. On one side, the engineering skill is undeniable, and in some cases extraordinary. The product of organised communities that clearly possessed sophisticated knowledge, planning capacity, and the social structures needed to sustain multi-generational projects. On the other side, the cultural intent behind all of that skill, the belief system that made these specific shapes and alignments and locations worth the effort, has not survived in any form we can directly access. The stones are here, the meaning is not. Across Europe, 7 of these sites stand as particularly striking examples of that silence. They range from a Cromlech in Portugal that predates Stonehenge by 2,000 years to freestanding temples on a small Mediterranean island that represents some of the earliest enclosed religious architecture anywhere on Earth. Each of them has been studied by some of the best researchers in archaeology, archaeoastronomy, and genetic anthropology. Each of them continues to resist a complete explanation. Competing theories about ritual use, Funerary practice, territorial marking, and sky alignment circle these monuments the way the seasons circle their alignments, returning again and again without ever quite landing. That is what this video is going to explore, not confident answers. The field does not have confident answers to offer, and anyone who tells you otherwise is overstating what the evidence actually supports. What we have instead are 7 extraordinary places, each of them a record of human ambition and organisational complexity that stretches back to the very edge of written history and beyond. Each of them a reminder that the people who came before us were capable of things that still challenge our understanding, and each of them wrapped in a silence that centuries of study and some of the most sophisticated scientific tools ever pointed at ancient stone have not yet broken. The alignments begin in Brittany, more than 3,000 stones waiting. Number 1. The Carnac Alignments. The previous section left you with a number. 3,000 stones. It is worth staying with that number for a moment before moving any further, because it is the kind of figure that sounds large in the abstract and becomes genuinely disorienting the moment you encounter the reality behind it. Stand at the western end of the Almendres Alignment on a clear morning, and what you see is not a monument in any conventional sense. There is no single focal point, no dramatic centerpiece to draw the eye. What you see instead is row after row after row of granite standing stones, some barely knee height, others taller than a person, receding into the distance until they dissolve into the haze of the Breton countryside. The rows continue beyond what you can see. They continued beyond what anyone standing there 6,000 years ago could see in a single glance either. The Carnac Alignments in Brittany, northwestern France, contain more than 3,000 standing stones, known as menhirs, distributed across approximately 10 kilometres of landscape. Concentrated into roughly 4 kilometres of visible rows, they represent the largest collection of standing stones anywhere in the world. The sheer density of the effort required to create this is staggering, even before you begin asking why anyone did it. Based on radiocarbon dating of charcoal, recovered from foundation pits beneath individual stones, combined with Bayesian statistical modelling that refines raw dates into tighter probability windows, researchers now place the primary phase of construction between approximately 4,600 and 4,300 BCE. That is roughly 6,000 years ago, making these rows among the earliest large-scale megalithic constructions anywhere in Europe. Some sources give a slightly broader range, between 4,500 and 3,300 BCE for the complex as a whole, and revisions remain possible as new sampling is conducted. But the most precise current estimates place the main effort of construction firmly in the centuries around 4,500 BCE, deep in the Neolithic period, long before writing, long before metallurgy, long before the world began leaving the kinds of records that historians are trained to read. The organising logic behind the rows is not entirely invisible. The alignments share a consistent north-northwest to south-southeast orientation, a pattern that is too consistent across too great a distance to be accidental. That orientation has attracted significant scholarly attention, with some researchers proposing that the rows were deliberately aligned to track something, whether a celestial body, a geographic feature, or a conceptual boundary between distinct zones of the landscape. One interpretation holds that the north-northwest to south-southeast axis may have functioned as a symbolic border between the inland world and the sea, a physical manifestation of a cultural division that mattered deeply to the communities who built and used the site. Under this reading, the alignments were not just marking territory in a political sense, but were inscribing meaning onto the landscape in a way that made a particular boundary visible, permanent, and perhaps sacred. That is a compelling idea. It is also, like every other interpretation of Carnac, impossible to confirm from the evidence currently available. The range of theories that have accumulated around this site over the centuries reflects both the richness of what the place seems to suggest and the fundamental limits of what archaeology can actually recover. Ritual procession is one of the most frequently cited explanations. The linear structure of the rows is reminiscent of an avenue, a path designed to be walked, and the discovery of hearth features alongside foundation pits supports the idea that fire-related ceremonies and communal gatherings took place here. The rows may have been the stage for collective rituals tied to seasonal events, feasting, or rites of passage that required a community to move through a defined landscape in a deliberate way. The scale of the construction itself can be read as evidence for this. If the alignments were processional routes, the sheer length and elaborateness of those routes would amplify their ceremonial power, transforming the act of walking through them into an immersive communal experience, unlike anything else in the Neolithic world. Territorial or symbolic border marking offers a different angle. Under this model, the rows serve to define and communicate cultural identity, to say to anyone approaching from outside that this landscape belonged to a particular group in a way that was not merely practical, but cosmological. The monumental effort involved in the construction becomes in this reading the point itself. You do not drag several thousand multi-ton granite blocks across 10 kilometres of countryside just to plant a boundary post. You do it to make a statement so durable that it will outlast every individual who built it. The rows on this reading were a declaration. Social display and the performance of power offer yet another framing. The logistical challenge of quarrying, transporting, and erecting more than 3,000 stones over a landscape of this scale would have required a level of communal organisation that suggests either a highly cohesive society or a social hierarchy capable of directing sustained collective labour across multiple generations. Some scholars interpret this organisational capacity itself as the message, a demonstration of the community's ability to mobilise resources and people on a scale that would have been visible and legible to anyone in the surrounding region. Under this interpretation, the alignments functioned somewhat as elite monuments do in many later societies, as proof of institutional power, divine sanction, or the ability of a governing group to command the labour of others. And then there are the astronomical theories which have generated perhaps the most enduring popular interest and the most sustained academic debate. In the 1970s, the Scottish engineer and archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom conducted extensive surveys of the Carnac Alignments and proposed that the rows were deliberately oriented to track solstitial sunsets and other celestial events, and that the spacing of the stones reflected a standardized unit of prehistoric measurement. He called the megalithic yard. If Thom's analysis was correct, Carnac would represent a sophisticated astronomical instrument, a stone-built observatory designed to record the movements of the sky with a precision that implied advanced mathematical knowledge. The proposal attracted enormous attention, both within archaeology and in the broader public conversation about prehistoric intelligence. It has also attracted sustained statistical criticism. Subsequent researchers applying more rigorous probabilistic methods to Thom's surveys found that the alignment patterns he identified could in significant part be explained by chance given the large number of stones, lines, and potential celestial targets available. The megalithic yard has never achieved consensus acceptance. Astronomical alignments may well be real at Carnac, and the north-northwest to south-southeast orientation of the rows remains genuinely suggestive, but no single sky-based purpose has won broad agreement among specialists. The astronomical theory remains on the table, one entry in a list of competing explanations rather than the solution that closes the debate. What is especially striking about this situation is that the uncertainty is not a product of neglect or limited investigation. Carnac has been studied continuously since at least the 18th century, and the sophistication of that study has increased dramatically in recent decades. Modern researchers have brought high-resolution aerial photography to the site, allowing analysis of the spatial relationships between rows at scales impossible to perceive from the ground. LiDAR scanning has mapped the underlying topography with extraordinary precision, revealing landscape features that connect different parts of the complex in ways that were previously unclear. Systematic radiocarbon sampling combined with Bayesian modelling has produced the tightest chronology the site has ever had. These are not trivial advances. They have resolved real questions about the sequence of construction, the age of individual features, and the physical layout of the monument in ways that genuinely matter for understanding what happened here. But they have not resolved the core question. No amount of improved topographic data tells you what the people who built these rows believed about them. No chronological precision recovers the ceremonies that may have taken place between these stones. The hearths found alongside the foundation pits confirm that fire was part of the story in some way. They do not explain what the fire meant, what was burned, what was said, what was hoped for, what was feared. The gap between what modern instruments can measure and what prehistoric communities actually thought and felt and intended is a gap that no instrument yet invented can bridge. This is the fundamental challenge that Carnac places in front of every researcher who approaches it, and it is a challenge that will recur at every site on this list. The monument's existence proves that its builders had extraordinary organisational capacity, practical intelligence, and the social cohesion to sustain a project of this scale across generations. The monument's form, those long, consistent, oriented rows stretching across the Breton countryside, clearly encodes some kind of meaning or purpose that was important enough to justify the effort. But the content of that meaning, the specific cultural logic that made this particular shape in this particular place, the right answer to whatever question these people were trying to answer, has not survived. It existed in living memory, in oral tradition, in embodied practice, in the shared understanding of communities that have been gone for 6,000 years, and none of those things leave a material record that archaeology can directly read. What we are left with at Carnac is an extraordinarily well-documented enigma. We know roughly when the stones were raised. We know how many there are and how they are arranged. We know the orientation they follow, and we have a growing understanding of the fire features and foundation deposits associated with their construction. We have 5 competing explanations, each of them internally coherent, each of them supported by at least some of the evidence, and none of them capable of accounting for all of it. The rows remain exactly as they have stood for 6 millennia, patient, parallel, and entirely uncommunicative about why they are there. From the coastal fields of Brittany, we move southwest to the Iberian Peninsula, and a monument that predates even Carnac, a stone circle on a Portuguese hilltop that was already ancient when the builders of these rows were born. Number 2, Almendres Cromlech. The hilltop outside Évora in southern Portugal does not announce itself dramatically. You approach through cork oak woodland, the trees twisted and bark stripped in that particular way of the Alentejo landscape. And then the stones appear between the trunks, granite, weathered, standing in arrangements that resolve, as you get closer, into something unmistakably deliberate. Roughly 95 menhirs, some upright, some tilted by centuries of soil movement, distributed across an oval area measuring approximately 70 metres by 40 metres. 2 concentric ellipses, a structured ceremonial space, whatever ceremony may have meant to the people who created it. This is the Almendres Cromlech, and its age is what stops you before anything else does. Based on radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis of the deposit layers surrounding the stones, researchers have identified 3 distinct construction phases at this site. The earliest, referred to as Almendres I, dates to approximately 6000 BCE, placing it in the early Neolithic. The second phase, Almendres II, corresponds to the Middle Neolithic, around 5000 BCE. The third and latest phase, Almendres III, dates to roughly 4000 BCE in the late Neolithic. Taken together, this means the site was not built at once but grew, and was modified over a period of approximately 2000 years. And the earliest activity here begins somewhere around 8000 years ago, possibly more. By the time Stonehenge was being planned in southern England, Almendres had already been a significant place for roughly 2000 years. That gap is worth pausing on. 2000 years of prior existence. When we talk about deep time in human terms, 2 millennia is long enough for entire civilizations to rise and collapse. Rome's history, from founding to the fall of the Western Empire, occupies roughly 1200 years. The interval between the people who first raised stones on this Portuguese hilltop and the people who began raising the famous Saracens at Stonehenge is longer than that. Whatever ideas, practices and beliefs animated the construction at Almendres, they were not simply transmitted intact across that chasm to communities in southern Britain, or perhaps they were in some altered form. That question, frustratingly, does not yet have a firm answer. The physical layout of the site distinguishes Almendres clearly from the linear logic of Carnac, where the Breton alignments stretch across the landscape in parallel rows oriented along a consistent axis. The Almendres stones form enclosed ellipses, creating an interior space rather than a directed path. This distinction matters for interpretation. An enclosed oval arrangement implies a centre, a gathering space, somewhere that people could stand within the structure rather than simply walk alongside it. It suggests a fundamentally different spatial experience from the one the Carnac rows provide, and potentially a different kind of activity, something more inward, more contained, more focused on what happened at the centre rather than on movement through the landscape. Whether that inference is correct depends on assumptions about how prehistoric communities used monumental space, and those assumptions are not easily tested. Several of the stones carry carved features that have attracted particular attention from researchers trying to understand the site's function. Cup marks, small dimpled depressions ground or pecked into the granite surface, appear on a number of the menhirs, and some researchers have proposed that these were used as positioning points for sighting stones or other devices intended to observe specific celestial events. One stone is oriented toward the spring equinox sunrise. A separate, isolated menhir stands approximately 1.4 kilometers from the main complex, and its alignment with the winter solstice sunrise has been noted by archaeoastronomers investigating the site. These are not negligible observations. An isolated stone placed at that specific distance and in that specific relationship to the main complex, aligned to the longest night of the year, suggests at minimum that whoever positioned it was paying careful attention to the sky. But here, the honest accounting of what we actually know becomes important, because the attractive quality of astronomical interpretations should not be mistaken for their certainty. Alignment hypotheses at sites like Almendres face a structural challenge. Given enough stones arranged over a large enough area, statistical coincidences between stone orientations and celestial events become increasingly likely. The question is not whether some alignments exist, but whether the alignments that exist are precise enough, consistent enough, and numerous enough to constitute strong evidence for deliberate astronomical intent rather than incidental pattern. At Almendres, the equinox and solstice alignments are genuinely suggestive. They are also debated. No single astronomical interpretation has achieved consensus among researchers working on the site, and the material evidence that would at most directly confirm or refute astronomical use, records, inscriptions, instruments, finds associated with astronomical observation, simply does not exist in recoverable form. The competing explanations for what Almendres was and what happened there reflect the same range we encountered at Carnac, though the enclosed nature of the space shades each interpretation differently. Ritual and ceremonial gathering is among the most frequently cited possibilities. The two concentric ellipses could have defined a sacred precinct, a space set apart from the ordinary landscape, where specific activities, offerings, or rites were conducted under conditions of controlled access. Social and territorial functions have also been proposed. A monument of this scale, visible from the surrounding landscape, and requiring sustained communal investment to construct over multiple phases, would have communicated something about the identity and organisational capacity of the communities associated with it, regardless of any more specific ceremonial purpose. And the three-phase construction history complicates all of these interpretations by implying that the site's meaning and use were not static. Whatever Almendres was in 6000 BCE may have been something recognisably different by 4000 BCE, adapted and elaborated by communities whose relationship to the existing stones was already partially archaeological, as ours is now. Modern documentation of the site has benefited from the same range of digital tools that are transforming archaeological recording more broadly. Laser scanning, drone-based LiDAR survey, and photogrammetric modelling have produced high-resolution, three-dimensional records of the stone positions, surface textures, erosion patterns, and possible sightlines between individual menhirs. A detailed 3D model of the complex is publicly available, offering a level of spatial precision that field survey alone could never match. These tools have genuine value. They clarify the geometry of the ellipses, reveal carved features that weathering has made hard to see with the naked eye, and allow researchers to test proposed sightlines between stones with a precision previously impossible. What they cannot do is tell you what the stones were for. The geometry of a sightline between two menhirs does not confirm that the sightline was intentional, let alone what knowledge or ceremony it served. The 3D model, impressive as it is, documents a mystery rather than resolving one. This brings us to the larger question that Almendres raises more sharply than almost any site in Europe, which is the question of connection. Standing stones, oval enclosures, and astronomical alignments appear across the Atlantic facade of Europe. From Portugal and Spain, northward, through France, Ireland, Britain, and Scotland, in forms that share enough family resemblance to raise the possibility of a shared cultural or intellectual tradition. Was there a network of ideas, perhaps transmitted through maritime contact along the Atlantic coast, that gave Neolithic communities from Iberia to the Hebrides access to a common set of architectural and astronomical concepts? Or did similar problems, how to mark territory, how to track the seasons, how to organise communal space, produce similar solutions independently in different places without requiring direct cultural connection? The chronology at Almendres makes this question genuinely difficult to resolve. If the site's earliest phase dates to around 6000 BCE, it predates almost every comparable monument in Atlantic Europe. That priority could support a diffusionist interpretation, ideas originating in Iberia and spreading northward over centuries or millennia. But the word could is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, Radiocarbon dates carry uncertainty ranges. Stratigraphic interpretations can be revised as new excavation data emerges. The chronologies of comparable sites elsewhere in Atlantic Europe are themselves subjects of ongoing revision, and the degree of precision required to establish the kind of temporal priority that would support confident claims about cultural influence simply exceeds what current dating methods can reliably deliver. Some researchers working on Atlantic megalithism favour models of connected traditions. Others emphasise local development and parallel invention. The honest answer is that both remain possible, and the evidence at hand, including the evidence from Almendres itself, is not yet sufficient to decide between them. What the site does demonstrate, unambiguously, and on the basis of its physical existence alone, is that the Neolithic communities of southern Portugal were engaged 8,000 years ago in sustained, organised, purposeful monument building on a scale that required planning across multiple generations. 3 building phases over 2,000 years is not the product of impulse or accident. It reflects a community that understood itself as part of a continuous project, that maintained the site, modified it, and returned to it across spans of time longer than most modern institutions have existed. The intention was clearly real. The commitment was clearly sustained. The meaning that sustained it is what we cannot reach. From the Cork Hills of the Alentejo, we move east across the Iberian Peninsula to a single stone chamber in Andalusia, where a different kind of engineering mystery is waiting, one that recently forced researchers to fundamentally revise their assumptions about what Neolithic builders were capable of perceiving and calculating. Number 3. Dolmen of Menga. The place that forces the revision is a hillside outside Antequera in the province of Malaga, where a low earthen mound rises from the Andalusian landscape with a deceptive modesty. From the outside, in isolation, you might walk past it. Step through the entrance, however, and the scale of what is overhead immediately changes the register. You're inside a roofed chamber, roughly 28 metres long, nearly 6 metres wide, and up to 3.5 metres high. Above your head, spanning the full width of the chamber, are enormous stone slabs resting on upright supports, with a stillness that has lasted 6,000 years. And the largest of those slabs, the one designated capstone number 5 in recent technical studies, stretches approximately 8 metres across and weighs somewhere in the vicinity of 150 tons. That figure needs to be held for a moment. 150 tons. The current best estimate from laser scanning and geomechanical analysis is approximately 149.6 tons, with an uncertainty of plus or minus around 9 tons. A single stone, placed overhead by communities who had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no written engineering manuals, no institutional memory outside of what could be passed from person to person through direct instruction and demonstration. The Dolmen of Menga, built somewhere between 3,800 and 3,600 BCE, is the oldest and largest of the great Antequera dolmens, and it contains one of the heaviest stone elements ever moved and placed in the prehistoric world. The engineering question, for a long time, was considered essentially unanswerable. We knew the stone was there. We could see that it had been placed. We could observe that it had not fallen. Beyond that, the mechanisms that made all of this possible were largely a matter of speculation, informed guessing dressed in the language of possibility. Then came a combination of modern tools that began to change that picture substantially, without, it must be said, providing the complete resolution that the question seems to demand. High-resolution laser scanning, 3-dimensional modelling, and detailed petrological analysis published across a series of studies in 2023 and 2024 revealed a construction sequence that is, to put it plainly, extraordinary in its sophistication. The stone was not brought from a distant quarry. Provenance analysis traced the materials to an outcrop less than a kilometre away, on a higher ridge above the eventual construction site. That proximity was not coincidence. It appears to have been deliberate selection. The builders chose a quarry site that would allow gravity to assist the movement of multi-ton stones downhill rather than requiring them to be hauled upward against slope. The transport mechanism, as reconstructed from physical traces and engineering modelling, likely involved wooden tracks or sledges that spread load and controlled movement across the terrain. The placement itself reveals something even more specific about Neolithic technical thinking. The upright stones at Menga are not simply stacked vertically. Analysis shows that they were deliberately tilted inward at an average angle of approximately 85 degrees from horizontal, a slight but calculated lean that creates a trapezoidal cross-section for the chamber. The foundation sockets cut into the bedrock, some of them between 1 and 3 meters deep, anchored the uprights and allowed builders to fine-tune their positions through a counterweight and ramp system with a precision that the researchers describe as operating at the millimetre scale. The result is what structural engineers recognise as a discharge arch, a configuration in which the geometry of the assembled stones distributes the enormous load of the roof across the uprights and down into the ground, preventing any single point from bearing more force than it can hold. The structure has been standing for approximately 6,000 years. The engineering rationale for why it is still standing is now, finally, technically legible to us. 32 stones in total, with a combined mass estimated at around 1,140 tons, quarried, transported, shaped, positioned, and integrated into a coherent structural system by a Neolithic community in southern Spain, who left no text explaining what they were doing or why. The how, thanks to laser scanning and geomechanical modelling, has become significantly clearer in recent years. The why remains, in fundamental ways, open, and the why at Menga is not a simple question, because the monument is not a simple thing. At the most basic level, Menga is a tomb. Human remains have been found within the chamber, and the architectural form, a covered passage leading to an enclosed burial space, belongs to a recognisable category of megalithic funerary monuments distributed across Atlantic Europe during the Neolithic period. That much can be stated with confidence, but the category of tomb does not exhaust the monument's apparent dimensions, and recent research has pushed the interpretation considerably further than simple funerary function can accommodate. The longitudinal axis of the chamber is oriented at approximately 45 degrees, pointing toward a prominent limestone cliff known as La Peña de los Enamorados, which rises dramatically from the plain roughly 4 kilometres to the northeast. This orientation is almost certainly not accidental, a natural feature of that visual prominence, visible from the entrance of the chamber along precisely the axis the builders chose, invites the interpretation that the monument was deliberately anchored to the landscape around it, that the cliff was not simply background scenery, but a meaningful element in a spatial and perhaps cosmological system. During the summer solstice, a light-shadow effect is observable inside the chamber, produced by the sun's alignment with the entrance along this same axis. An astronomical or cosmological dimension to the monument's orientation is genuinely difficult to dismiss. But here is where the honest accounting matters, because the existence of an astronomical alignment does not determine what the alignment meant, or whether it was the primary purpose of the monument, or whether it was one consideration among several, or whether our identification of it reflects the builder's intent rather than our own pattern seeking. The same caveat applies to the landscape orientation toward La Peña de los Enamorados. The cliff is striking. The alignment is real. What that alignment communicated to the people who designed it and the people who used the space remains beyond the reach of the evidence currently available. Scholarly debate over Menga's broader cultural role has produced a range of competing interpretations that the physical evidence, on its own, cannot fully adjudicate. Funerary function is established but incomplete as an explanation for the monument's scale and complexity. A structure of this engineering ambition, requiring the organised labour of a substantial community over an extended period, seems to exceed what straightforward burial would demand. The surplus effort, if that framing is appropriate, invites further explanation. Territorial and political signalling is one candidate. A monument visible on the landscape, associated with the remains of community members, and demonstrable of an organisational capacity that smaller neighbouring groups could not match, would have functioned as a statement about identity, continuity, and power, a claim staked in stone and maintained across generations. The sheer scale of the construction could be read as a form of communication directed outward, toward rival or neighbouring communities as much as inward, toward the ancestors or the cosmos. Elite political display offers a related but distinct angle. The monument may have been the project of a particular lineage or leadership group, and its construction may have consolidated social authority as much as it honoured the dead. The concentration of architectural ambition in a single dominant structure, rather than distributed across many smaller ones, is consistent with social arrangements in which power was beginning to concentrate in ways that earlier, more egalitarian Neolithic communities did not exhibit. But the human remains from Menga are limited, the DNA evidence is scarce, and the iconographic record inside the chamber is ambiguous. The evidence that would most directly support or undermine a social stratification argument has not survived in forms that yield clear answers. This is precisely the tension that makes Menga such a useful lens for thinking about megalithic sites more broadly, and it connects directly to a theme that appears at almost every major monument in this series. Modern tools have dramatically improved our understanding of the technical dimension of what was built. The laser scans are precise, the geomechanical models are rigorous, the provenance analysis is detailed. We now know with a degree of confidence that was impossible a generation ago how the stones were selected, how they were moved, and how the structure was assembled in a sequence that minimized risk and distributed load with geometric sophistication. That knowledge is genuine and significant. It confirms that the people who built Menga were not simply strong and determined. They were, in whatever framework they operated within, technically intelligent in ways that demanded planning, calculation, and the transmission of specialized knowledge across time. What we cannot recover through any scanning technology or geochemical analysis is the interior life of that knowledge. We cannot know whether the builders experienced what they were doing as engineering in any sense we would recognize, or whether the technical and the sacred were inseparable categories for them, or whether the monument's orientation toward a cliff and a solstice sunrise was a calculation, a belief, a story, or all three at once. The distinction between those possibilities may not have existed for the people who quarried and moved and placed these stones. It exists for us because we inherit a tradition that separates technical from symbolic knowledge, and we impose that separation on evidence that may have emerged from a world where no such separation applied. What Menga offers, then, is a particularly clear version of a problem that recurs across the megalithic record of Europe. The engineering is legible, increasingly so, and it is genuinely impressive. The intent behind the engineering remains, in its deeper dimensions, a matter of inference, debate, and honest uncertainty. We know the stones are there, and we are beginning to understand in considerable detail how they got there. What they meant to the hands that placed them is a question that the stones themselves cannot fully answer, and may never resolve. From the limestone hills of Andalusia, we move northwest and far forward in the narrative of Atlantic megalithism to the Boyne Valley in Ireland, where a monument built roughly 3,200 years before the Common Era transforms a single moment of winter light into an event that still draws crowds and still generates argument about what its builders truly intended. Number 4. Newgrange. The Boyne Valley in County Meath holds one of the most extraordinary structures in the prehistoric world, and one of the most frequently misunderstood. Newgrange was built around 3200 BCE, which places it approximately 5,200 years in the past. That number alone should pause anyone inclined to treat it as merely ancient. It predates Stonehenge by several centuries. It predates the Egyptian pyramids. It was already an old monument when pharaohs were first buried in the Valley of the Kings, and the people who built it left behind a structure of such technical and symbolic density that 5 millennia of weathering, several decades of modern excavation, and all the instruments of contemporary archaeology have not produced a single agreed account of what it was fundamentally for. The mound itself is massive. Roughly 85 metres in diameter and 12 metres high, it contains an estimated 200,000 tonnes of earth and stone. Running through the interior from the entrance on the southeastern face is a passage approximately 19 metres long, lined with large upright stones and roofed with corbelled slabs, opening at the far end into a cruciform chamber where human remains were found. That is the basic description. What elevates Newgrange from an impressive Neolithic tomb into something genuinely hard to categorise is what happens once a year, for approximately 17 minutes, on the morning of the winter solstice. Above the entrance, set just beneath the outer roof line, is a narrow aperture known as the roof box. When the sun rises on the solstice, its light enters through this opening at an angle precisely calculated to send a beam of light down the full length of the passage and illuminate the back wall of the inner chamber. The effect is exact. Modern astronomical calculations confirm that 5,000 years ago, before the gradual shift in the Earth's axial tilt altered the geometry slightly, the beam would have struck the back wall precisely at sunrise, with even greater precision than it achieves today. This was not an accident. The orientation was intentional. The roof box was engineered to admit light from a specific angle on a specific day of the year, and the builders achieved it with an accuracy that compares favourably to any later astronomical architecture we know of. That discovery, first formally recorded in modern times by the archaeologist Michael O'Kelly in 1967, after he spent years pressing the local office of public works to allow him to sit inside the chamber on solstice morning, seemed for a while like the answer. Here was a Neolithic monument with a demonstrable astronomical function. The winter solstice is the shortest day, the turning point of the sun's apparent retreat, the moment when light begins its slow return after the long darkening. A passage that captures that moment in stone, that channels a thin blade of light to the heart of a burial chamber on precisely that morning, could be read as a symbolic integration of solar renewal with the presence of the dead. The light reaches the dead on the day the sun is reborn. The explanation feels intuitively satisfying, almost complete, but it is not complete. And the longer you stay with what Newgrange actually contains, the more clearly that becomes. Consider the labour. The mound was not assembled from locally available rubble. The builders brought white quartz from the Wicklow Mountains, roughly 50 kilometres to the south, and granodiorite boulders from the Mourne Mountains to the north. The most plausible transport route runs along the Boyne River by boat, followed by a climb uphill to the construction site. The curbstones encircling the base of the mound, 97 of them, each substantial, were selected and positioned as a continuous enclosure. The scale of organised effort this implies in terms of community mobilisation, logistics, and sustained labour over what must have been an extended construction period goes well beyond what a single annual light display would seem to require. You do not move hundreds of thousands of tons of material over generations and across 50 kilometres of terrain simply to create a 17-minute solar event, however moving that event might be. Then there is the rock art. More than 100 carved stones have been identified within and around Newgrange, featuring an astonishing variety of motifs organised across 10 recognised stylistic groups: spirals, arcs, lozenges, chevrons, concentric circles, and the celebrated triskel on the entrance stone, that three-armed spiral that has become almost synonymous with Irish prehistoric art, all appear across the surfaces of stones that were, in many cases, carved before they were erected. Some of the most elaborate carvings face inward, hidden once the structure was assembled, never intended for regular viewing. This is not decorative art in any conventional sense. It is not display addressed to a passing audience. Whatever these symbols communicated, they were not purely performative. They mattered in themselves, or in their making, in ways that our category of decoration cannot accommodate. What the carvings meant is genuinely unknown. Interpretations have ranged from depictions of altered states of consciousness, to solar and lunar cycles rendered geometrically, to territorial or identity markers expressing the symbolic vocabulary of a particular lineage or community. No Rosetta Stone exists for Neolithic Irish iconography. No later text preserves an interpretive tradition that runs back to the people who made these marks. We can describe them with precision, measure them, compare them to similar motifs at other megalithic sites across Atlantic Europe, identify family resemblances, and note that some of the same geometric vocabularies appear from Portugal to the Orkney Islands. What we cannot do is read them. The elaborate visual programme at Newgrange communicates something. We do not know what. DNA analysis of a skull recovered from the burial chamber has added yet another dimension to the interpretive problem. The results, published in 2020, revealed that the individual had parents who were first-degree relatives, meaning a brother and sister, or a parent and child. The statistical likelihood of this occurring by chance is vanishingly small. The implication is that this person's parentage was not accidental, but was, in some social framework, sanctioned or even prescribed. The closest analogies in later historical societies are royal or priestly lineages in which the maintenance of bloodline purity was understood as a religious or political imperative, as in certain Egyptian dynastic traditions. The term that has been applied loosely in popular coverage, Irish pharaoh, is an overreach, but the underlying point is serious. Newgrange appears to have been associated with a socially exceptional individual whose conception was structured by rules governing elite reproduction. That is not the funerary record of an egalitarian community honouring its dead collectively. It suggests a degree of social hierarchy and symbolic concentration of authority that raises entirely new questions about who the monument served, who controlled access to it, and what the solstice illumination meant within that power structure. Was the annual light event a ritual restricted to an elite lineage? Was the chamber a space of exclusive ancestral communion, the dead illuminated by the returning sun as a demonstration of their family's special relationship with cosmic forces? Or was the solstice alignment a shared public spectacle, a claim made by a ruling group on behalf of a whole community, with the light confirming the authority of the living through the sanction of the dead? All of these readings are consistent with the physical evidence. None of them is required by it. Then there is the question of what we are actually looking at when we visit Newgrange today. The gleaming white quartz facade that wraps the front face of the mound is almost certainly not original to the site's ancient appearance. During the excavations led by O'Kelly in the 1960s and 1970s, a large quantity of quartz was found tumbled in front of the entrance. The decision to reconstruct it as a vertical facing, backed by a concrete retaining wall, has been disputed by archaeologists ever since. Some argue the quartz originally formed a sloping apron on the ground rather than a standing wall. Others defend the reconstruction as a plausible interpretation consistent with the available evidence. The concrete support behind the facade is visible, and it is plainly modern. The controversy matters because what visitors see and photograph, the brilliant white facade that makes Newgrange one of the most recognisable prehistoric monuments in Europe, may represent an interpretation of the site as much as it represents the site itself. Preservation choices at Newgrange have shaped the monument's contemporary image in ways that are difficult to fully separate from the archaeological facts underneath. Similarly, the status of the roof box has been questioned. Some scholars have argued that the roof box opening, critical to the solstice illumination effect, was identified only during excavation and may have been partially reconstructed or reoriented in ways that amplify the solar alignment beyond what the original structure produced. Others maintain that the astronomical precision is sufficiently exact to rule out chance and to confirm intent. The debate is unresolved, and it serves as a reminder that even the feature of Newgrange that appears most legible, the one that seems to provide a clear answer, rests partly on interpretive decisions made during 20th century restoration work. Modern geophysical surveys using microgravity and ground-penetrating radar have recently identified what appears to be a probable second chamber on the opposite side of the mound. Inaccessible without excavation, its contents unknown. The existence of a potential mirror structure changes the interpretive picture again. If a second chamber exists, aligned toward the summer solstice or some other celestial event, the monument becomes considerably more complex than the winter solstice explanation can contain. But the second chamber has not been excavated. It remains a geophysical signal, suggestive and tantalizing, not yet part of the factual record. This is what Newgrange ultimately demonstrates, that astronomical precision and ritual ambiguity can coexist in the same structure, that the thing we can measure most exactly, the angle of a winter sunrise through a stone aperture, may illuminate the chamber without illuminating the purpose. The solstice phenomenon is real. It is important. It tells us something true about the people who built this monument and about the significance of solar cycles in their world. But it is one layer in a structure that contains an inbred elite burial, 100 carved symbols no one can read, material brought from 50 kilometres in every direction, a probable second hidden chamber, and a reconstructed facade that shapes what we see when we look at it. Newgrange gives us a precise answer to one narrow question and leaves the larger question of what it meant to its builders as open as it has ever been. Number 5. The Callanish Stones. If Newgrange teaches us that even the most dramatically legible prehistoric monument can resist a final interpretation, then the Callanish Stones on the Isle of Lewis offer a variation on that lesson that is harder still to dismiss. Here, on a windswept peninsula jutting into Loch Rogue, on the western edge of the Outer Hebrides, a complex of standing stones was erected around 2750 BCE, making it older than Stonehenge and broadly contemporary with Newgrange, part of that same extended Neolithic moment across Atlantic Europe when communities were investing extraordinary collective effort in permanent stone structures whose purpose we still cannot definitively name. What immediately distinguishes Callanish from other prehistoric monuments is its layout. This is not simply a ring of stones placed in a clearing. The site is organised with an architectural logic that suggests deliberate, carefully planned construction. At its heart stands a circle of 13 stones, approximately 11.5 metres in diameter, enclosing a central monolith that rises nearly 5 metres tall. That central pillar is oriented so that its faces align almost exactly north to south, a detail precise enough to suggest intent rather than coincidence. Radiating outward from the circle in 4 directions are rows of standing stones that create a cruciform pattern visible from any elevated vantage point nearby. The most impressive of these is the northern avenue, a double row of 19 stones, extending roughly 83 metres from the circle's edge, forming an approach corridor unlike anything at comparable sites. 3 shorter rows extend to the east-northeast, south and west-southwest, ranging from around 13 to 27 metres in length. Set into the eastern interior of the circle is a chambered tomb, approximately 6.5 metres long, its presence suggesting that the dead were incorporated into the spatial logic of the site from an early period. The overall effect is of a monument that thinks in multiple directions simultaneously, oriented outward toward landscape, horizon, and sky, while remaining centred on a defined ritual interior. The landscape setting amplifies this quality. The stones stand on a low ridge above the loch, visible for considerable distances across the surrounding terrain, and the treeless environment of the Outer Hebrides means that sight lines to the horizon in every direction remain largely unobstructed. To anyone trying to track celestial events over an open landscape, Callanish occupies a position that functions almost like a natural platform for observation. This is why the astronomical interpretations of the site have proven so persistent and so hard to evaluate fairly. The most significant of these interpretations centres on the moon rather than the sun. Researchers, most notably Alexander Thom and later Gerald Hawkins, proposed that Callanish functioned as a prehistoric lunar observatory, and the specific phenomenon under discussion is the lunar standstill, a cycle that runs on an approximately 18.5-year rhythm. During the major standstill, the moon rises and sets at its most extreme positions along the horizon, and at Callanish's latitude, the effect is particularly dramatic. The full moon at major standstill skims very low above the southern horizon, and when viewed from within the avenue, appears to move along the hillside of a nearby ridge known as Sleeping Beauty or Callanish Stones, before setting in a configuration that would have made an extraordinary visual impression. The Northern Avenue's orientation has been identified as broadly consistent with this event, and various individual alignments within the complex have been read as encoding awareness of the lunar standstill cycle. A 2026 University of Adelaide study brought more rigorous statistical methods to bear on this question, using both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional analysis to examine the concentration of celestial alignments at Callanish and other early stone circles. The results showed a statistically significant clustering of alignments toward both solar and lunar targets, including the 18.5-year standstill. This is not nothing. Statistical significance means the patterns are unlikely to have arisen purely by chance. But significance in a statistical sense does not translate cleanly into certainty about purpose. And here is where the honest account of Callanish has to slow down and resist the pull of a tidy conclusion. Critics of the lunar observatory hypothesis raise a set of objections that remain genuinely unresolved. First, the positions of the stones as they stand today are not guaranteed to be their original positions. Millennia of weathering, the gradual accumulation of peat that buried the lower portions of many stones until they were cleared in the 19th century, and the possibility of earlier disturbance mean that the precise geometry of sightlines cannot be assumed to be intact. A difference of even a few degrees in a stone's lean or position can shift an alignment from meaningful to coincidental. Second, a complex that contains as many stones arranged at as many angles as Callanish does will, by mathematical inevitability, produce multiple apparent alignments when tested against the range of possible celestial events over an 18,000-year span of cultural occupation. The question is always whether the alignments present exceed what chance geometry would predict, and how much excess is required before we are justified in inferring intent. The University of Adelaide study argues that the excess is meaningful. Skeptics argue that the assumptions built into alignment testing are themselves too generous. Modern technology has sharpened the tools available for this argument without resolving it. A three-dimensional laser scanning campaign using a Menzi GS200 instrument recorded more than 50 million individual points across the Callanish complex, achieving accuracy within 6 millimeters. The resulting point cloud can be geo-referenced, fed into astronomical simulation software such as Stellarium, and used to test proposed alignments against reconstructed ancient skies. This is genuinely impressive. It means that hypotheses about solar or lunar targets at Callanish can now be evaluated with a precision that was not possible even 2 decades ago. But the scanning captures the stones as they are now, and the uncertainty about their original positions remains. The data refines the debate considerably. It does not end it. Adding to the interpretive complexity is the unresolved chronology of the complex itself. The stone circle is generally dated to between 2900 and 2600 BCE, a range that already spans 3 centuries and allows for the possibility that the monument was constructed, modified, or expanded in multiple phases rather than in a single planned effort. The radiating stone rows may have been erected simultaneously with a circle or at some later point. The chambered tomb, whose presence gives the site an unmistakably funerary dimension, was likely added after the initial construction. This means that what we see today at Callanish may be the accumulated product of different communities making different decisions about the site over an extended period, layering functions and meanings in ways that no single interpretive framework, whether astronomical, funerary, or ritual, can capture entirely. This is one of the core problems with the lunar observatory reading. It requires Callanish to have been designed from the outset with a single coherent astronomical purpose, maintained across generations and across a chronological window that may span centuries. For that to be true, the builders would have needed a continuous and precise understanding of the lunar standstill cycle, which requires sustained observation over at least one full 18.5-year period to confirm and record, and they would have needed to translate that knowledge into architectural form with enough accuracy to encode it in stone. None of this is impossible. It is not even implausible, given the evident sophistication of the people who transported the megaliths of Newgrange from distant quarries or raised the enormous capstone of the Dolmen of Menga. But it is a claim that goes well beyond what the physical evidence alone can prove. Other interpretations place less weight on astronomical precision and more on the ceremonial and social dimensions of the site. The avenue, with its long double row of stones, suggests a structured approach, a formalised path that would have shaped movement and experience, directing participants toward the circle's interior in a way that implies choreographed ritual rather than observation. The inclusion of a burial tomb within the circle connects the site to a broader Neolithic tradition of integrating the dead into communal ceremonial space, a tradition visible across Atlantic Europe, from the passage tombs of Ireland to the dolmens of Iberia. On this reading, Callanish was a place where communities gathered, moved through a curated landscape, connected with ancestral remains, and marked occasions, perhaps including celestial ones, through embodied participation rather than detached astronomical recording. None of these interpretations excludes the others. A site can be a place of communal gathering, a landscape marker of territorial or social identity, a ceremonial space organised around ancestral burial, and a structure attentive to celestial cycles all at once. The mistake that the history of Callanish scholarship tends to fall into is the assumption that finding a convincing alignment or a statistically significant clustering of alignments or a striking visual coincidence between the avenue and the standstill moon is equivalent to identifying the site's purpose. It is not. The builders of Callanish may well have cared deeply about the lunar standstill and incorporated it deliberately into the monument's geometry. That tells us something important about their cosmological concerns. It does not tell us what happened at the site on any given night, or what relationship the living maintained with the dead in the tomb, or what social authority was expressed or reinforced through the act of construction and the ongoing life of the monument. What Callanish ultimately illustrates is the danger of pattern seeking in prehistoric contexts. The more analytical tools we apply, the more patterns we find. Laser scans, statistical analyses of alignment clusters, three-dimensional reconstructions of ancient skies, all of these methods produce genuine knowledge, and that knowledge matters. But patterns generated by powerful tools still require interpretation, and interpretation at this distance, without texts, without surviving ritual traditions, without any continuity of transmitted meaning reaching back to the Neolithic, remains irreducibly speculative. We can say with confidence that the builders of Callanish created a monument of remarkable geometric and spatial complexity, placed it in a landscape setting that maximizes horizon visibility, and arranged its elements in ways that intersect meaningfully with solar and lunar cycles. How they understood those intersections, what they did in that stone-lined space across the generations of its use, and what compelled them to raise these particular stones on this particular ridge above the grey Atlantic waters remains, after 5,000 years, and every tool we have brought to bear on it, genuinely unknown. Number 6. Stonehenge. Callanish reminds us that a monument can be studied with extraordinary technical precision and still resist a final explanation. But if you want the most dramatic illustration of that principle in all of European prehistory, you turn to the site that has been examined longer, written about more extensively, and photographed more times than any other megalithic structure in the world. Stonehenge stands on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire as the defining symbol of prehistoric mystery, the image most people reach for when they try to picture the ancient past. And yet, for all the centuries of investigation, for all the excavations and surveys and scientific analyses, Stonehenge continues to shelter questions that no one has satisfactorily answered. Familiarity, it turns out, is not the same as understanding. The monument's iconic silhouette is so deeply embedded in popular culture that most people assume they know what Stonehenge looks like. But what we see today is not what was there. It is not even a reliable approximation of what was there. Numerous upright stones are missing, and the pattern of absences is not random. Consider the most famous sightline at the entire site, the midsummer solstice sunrise viewed from the monument's centre through the heel stone. That alignment once ran through a carefully positioned arrangement of paired uprights. At least 6 of those stones are now gone, leaving only a single survivor, stone 56, standing where a matched set once framed the horizon. The solstice alignment that has become the monument's most celebrated feature, the one that draws tens of thousands of visitors every midsummer morning, is in fact a fragment of a much more complex original arrangement whose full form we cannot recover. The missing stones extend well beyond that solstice corridor. 17th century surveys by John Aubrey recorded evidence of an outer stone circle approximately 85 metres in diameter, roughly 280 feet across. That entire circle is now absent. The stones are gone, almost certainly removed at some point during the intervening centuries for use elsewhere, their precise positions surviving only as crop marks, geophysical anomalies, and the faint documentary traces left by Aubrey and his contemporaries. When we overlay the monument as it currently exists with the evidence for what once stood there, the gaps become more than cosmetic. They become interpretively significant. Any claim about what Stonehenge meant, how it was used, or what its spatial logic expressed depends on assumptions about a layout that we cannot fully verify. This leads directly to one of the most genuinely unsettling questions in current Stonehenge scholarship. Was the monument ever finished? The southwest arc of the Sarsen Circle, the outer ring of massive upright stones capped with lintels, contains only a single standing stone. There is not enough surviving material in that sector, whether upright or fallen, to reconstruct a complete ring. 2 competing explanations present themselves. Either the stones on the southwest side were removed and the monument was once complete, or that sector was never filled in, and Stonehenge as conceived was left unfinished. The unfinished monument hypothesis is not fringe speculation. Serious researchers working with the available stone counts, the quarry evidence, and the internal geometry of the structure have advanced it as a credible possibility. If true, it fundamentally changes how we interpret the site. A monument that was deliberately left open on one side was either operating within a design logic we do not understand, or was abandoned before its builder's intentions were realised. Either possibility is more complicated and more interesting than the tidy circle that appears on every postcard. Modern tools have brought fresh detail to these questions without resolving them. In 2011, a high-resolution laser scanning campaign produced a sub-millimetre 3-dimensional point cloud of every standing and fallen stone at the site, creating a digital archive of extraordinary precision. Virtual reconstructions built from that data allow researchers to test proposed layouts, examine weathering patterns over time, and model what the monument might have looked like if the missing stones were restored to various hypothetical positions. The scans are genuinely valuable. They capture the current state of every surface with an accuracy that earlier survey methods could never approach, and they provide a baseline against which future changes can be measured. But they record the stones as they are now, not as they were arranged across the site's long and complicated construction history. The precision of the digital model does not project backwards through the centuries of removal, collapse, and decay that separate the present from the monument's various active phases. Isotope analysis has added another dimension to the story. A 2024 study published in Nature examined the altar stone, a large recumbent sandstone block lying at the monument's centre, using multi-isotope analysis involving uranium-lead, lutetium-hafnium, and strontium ratios. The results pointed to a provenance in the Orcadian Basin of northeast Scotland, more than 750 kilometres from Salisbury Plain. This is a remarkable finding. The bluestones that form the monument's inner arrangement are already known to have come from the Prehistoric Hills in Wales, approximately 250 kilometres away, a transport feat that has long been cited as evidence of the extraordinary organisational capacity of Neolithic communities. The altar stone, if it truly originated in northeast Scotland, extends the radius of that network dramatically and raises profound questions about the social connections, the exchange relationships, or the pilgrimage routes that may have linked communities across the full length of Britain. It adds new complexity to a picture that was already complex. What it does not do is tell us why the stone was placed where it was, what role it played in the monument's ceremonial life, or what relationship its distant origin held to its function on site. The famous astronomical alignment remains at the centre of interpretive debate, and the honest account of it requires the same patience we applied to Callanish. The monument is oriented so that on the summer solstice the sun rises over the heel stone, and its light penetrates toward the monument's centre. In the opposing direction, at midwinter, the setting sun sinks between the uprights of the great central trilithon. These alignments are real. They are unlikely to be accidental in a structure that required this scale of effort and planning. But they do not settle the central question. A building can incorporate astronomical alignment into its design without being primarily an astronomical observatory, just as a medieval cathedral oriented east toward the rising sun is a building about Christian worship, not a solar tracking facility. The solstice alignments at Stonehenge demonstrate that the builders paid careful attention to the sun's movements and considered them worth encoding in stone. What that attention meant within their cosmological understanding, their ritual calendar, their relationship to the dead, or their political and social organisation remains entirely open. The interpretive frameworks that researchers have applied to Stonehenge over the years form a long and sometimes contradictory list. A healing sanctuary drawing the sick from across Britain, evidenced by skeletal remains showing signs of disease and trauma. A monument to ancestral veneration, with its long association with cremation burials. A territorial marker expressing the power of a particular social group over the landscape and labour needed to construct it. A calendrical instrument regulating agricultural or ceremonial cycles. A place of cosmological integration connecting the living with celestial forces. Isotope work on human remains buried at the site indicates that people came from distant regions of Britain and possibly beyond, suggesting that Stonehenge functioned within a wide network of movement and connection, not as a purely local monument. That finding supports several of these interpretations simultaneously, while confirming none of them exclusively. What makes Stonehenge the most instructive case in this entire survey is not that it has been neglected. The opposite is true. No prehistoric monument on Earth has received more archaeological attention, more scientific scrutiny, more theoretical elaboration. Excavations have taken place across more than 2 centuries. Radiocarbon dating has been applied repeatedly, refining the construction chronology to a sequence of phases extending from roughly 3000 BCE through to approximately 1500 BCE, a span of 15 centuries, during which the monument was repeatedly modified, extended, and rearranged by communities whose specific intentions at each stage remain largely invisible to us. Geophysical survey has mapped buried features across the surrounding landscape, revealing a Stonehenge embedded in a dense ceremonial complex rather than standing in isolation. DNA analysis of associated human remains has illuminated the ancestry and movement of the people buried there. 3-dimensional digital reconstruction has given us virtual models of possible original configurations. Each of these advances represents genuine knowledge genuinely hard-won. And yet the monument keeps the deepest part of its secret. We do not know with certainty what the original layout was. We do not know whether it was ever completed. We do not know whether the solstice alignments were the primary organising principle of the design or one consideration among many. We do not know why stones were transported from the far north of Scotland when closer materials were available. We do not know what transformed this particular piece of chalk downland into a place worth returning to, worth modifying, worth investing in across 50 generations of human life. Stonehenge is often treated as the place where questions about megalithic culture begin and end, the definitive case study that, if fully cracked, would illuminate the rest. But the honest lesson of every tool, every isotope, every scan, every excavation trench is the reverse. Stonehenge demonstrates that even the most intensively studied site can preserve a core of genuine, stubbornly enduring unknowns. The missing stones are not simply an archaeological puzzle awaiting the right methodology. They are a physical embodiment of the limits of what survives and what we can know at a distance of 5,000 years. Number 7. Ġgantija Temples. Stonehenge teaches us that intensive study, applied over centuries with increasingly sophisticated tools, does not guarantee resolution. It guarantees better questions. And the final site in this survey takes that lesson and relocates it to a place most people never associate with megalithic civilization at all. Not the windswept plains of England, not the Atlantic coastline of France, not the uplands of Scotland. Instead, a small island in the Mediterranean Sea off the southern coast of Sicily, baked by sun and surrounded by blue water. The island of Gozo, part of the Maltese archipelago, is home to what are almost certainly the oldest surviving freestanding stone structures on the surface of the earth. The Ġgantija Temples have been standing here since approximately 3,800 to 3,600 BCE, making them roughly 5,600 to 6,000 years old, older than the pyramids at Giza by more than 1,000 years, older than Stonehenge's first major construction phase, and predating some of the earliest entries on this list. That age alone would make them remarkable. But what compounds the astonishment is what was actually built. Ġgantija is not a row of standing stones. It is not a burial chamber with a capping stone. It is an enclosed architectural complex, 2 large temples built side by side within a shared external boundary wall, their interiors organised into a distinctive cloverleaf plan of 5 semicircular apses arranged around a central corridor. The walls are constructed from massive blocks of coralline limestone, some of them weighing several tons, stacked and fitted into curved forms that demanded not only physical strength, but spatial and geometric reasoning. The interior surfaces used a smoother Globigerina limestone, a deliberate distinction between outer and inner material that suggests conscious choices about texture, appearance, or symbolism. The taller of the 2 temples still rises to approximately 6 meters in height at points, and it was raised without the wheel, without metal tools, and without any written tradition of architectural knowledge to draw on. The builders of Ġgantija worked entirely within a Neolithic toolkit: stone, bone, antler, rope, timber rollers, and an organisational capacity that modern engineers studying the site find genuinely difficult to account for. The complex faces southeast and its orientation aligns with the equinox sunrise, a deliberate positioning that places Ġgantija within the same tradition of sky-attentive design we encountered at Newgrange, at Callanish, at Stonehenge. Other Maltese temples, including the site of Menidra further along the archipelago, share this equinox orientation, which suggests that the alignment was not accidental or site-specific, but represented a considered, culturally transmitted practice. The builders of these temples looked at the sky with purpose. They chose to anchor their architecture to the moment of balance between light and dark. That much seems secure. What it meant to stand inside these walls as the equinox sunrise entered, what ritual or cosmological significance that moment carried, what words were spoken, or what actions performed, remains entirely beyond recovery. The interior of the temples has yielded a range of material evidence pointing broadly toward ritual use. Figurines have been found that bear a striking resemblance to the Venus of Willendorf tradition, rounded female forms that appear across wide swathes of prehistoric Europe, their presence here suggesting either cultural connection or an independent convergence on similar symbolic vocabulary. Animal bone deposits indicate that some form of sacrifice or communal feasting took place within the apses. Features interpreted as possible ablution basins suggest purification rituals. Taken together, this evidence points toward a site of worship, of ceremonial activity involving the community, possibly involving the propitiation of deities or ancestral powers, possibly involving the marking of seasonal or cosmological events. But scholars are careful to note that this picture is assembled from fragments. The exact symbolic meaning of the figurines, the precise nature of the rituals conducted, the social structure of the community that gathered here, and the theological framework within which Ġgantija made sense to the people who built and used it. All of this remains genuinely unknown. One of the most persistent, unresolved questions concerns the roof. The temples are open to the sky today, but were they always? Three-dimensional stress simulations conducted in recent years have demonstrated that the walls of Ġgantija are structurally capable of supporting a stone roof. The engineering, in other words, does not rule it out, but no definitive evidence of a stone roof has been recovered, and a timber roof, which would leave far less durable archaeological trace, remains an equally plausible reconstruction. This single question, roof or no roof, stone or timber, matters more than it might initially seem, because it changes the interior experience of the space entirely. A roofed enclosure creates darkness, interiority, separation from the world outside, conditions often associated with initiation, concealment, and sacred exclusivity. An open space under the sky creates a different relationship between the human interior and the astronomical exterior. Without resolving the roof question, we cannot confidently reconstruct what it felt like to be inside Ġgantija during whatever ceremonies took place there. Modern tools are bringing new precision to these questions without eliminating their essential uncertainty. In 2026, Heritage Malta completed a comprehensive digital twin of the Ġgantija complex, combining drone photogrammetry, LiDAR laser scanning, and three-dimensional modelling, producing a searchable, high-resolution dataset of the entire site. This mirrors the kind of digital documentation applied to Stonehenge and other sites in this list, and it represents a genuine preservation achievement, capturing the current condition of every stone surface with a fidelity that earlier survey methods could not approach. The dataset allows researchers to study structural details remotely, track deterioration over time, and model proposed reconstructions with unprecedented accuracy. What it cannot do is reach back through 6,000 years of weathering, modification, and silence to recover the living system of belief that gave the architecture its meaning. The digital twin preserves the envelope. The interior life of the place is gone. Radiocarbon dates for Ġgantija, refined through Bayesian statistical modelling, now consistently place the construction of the Maltese temple complex in the late 5th millennium BCE, somewhere between approximately 3,800 and 3,600 BCE, with calibration uncertainties that may yet shift this window slightly in either direction as new data is applied. This chronology places Ġgantija at roughly the same broad horizon as several other sites examined here, including the Dolmen of Menga, Carnac in its later phases, and the earliest activity at Newgrange. Whether this temporal clustering reflects genuine cultural connection across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, some shared pan-European impulse toward monumental stone construction during this period, or simply an independent convergence of separate traditions arriving at similar solutions under different pressures, is precisely the question that defines the deepest puzzle this list has been circling throughout. This is where Ġgantija offers something the other sites on this list cannot quite provide in the same way, a direct architectural contrast that sharpens the central question. Every other site we have examined is built from standing stones arranged in lines, circles, or burial chambers. The upright menhir tradition that stretches from Almendres in Portugal to Carnac in France, from Newgrange in Ireland to Callanish in Scotland, from Menga in Andalusia to Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain. Ġgantija is different. Its builders did not work primarily with single standing stones. They designed enclosed rooms, curved walls, architectural sequences with thresholds and apses. They created interior space in a way that the standing stone traditions largely did not. If these traditions shared a common origin, a common megalithic mindset diffusing outward from some earlier centre, then the divergence between the Atlantic standing stone tradition and the Maltese enclosed temple tradition demands explanation. If they were independent developments, arising separately in different communities responding to different ecological, social, and cosmological conditions, then the apparent similarities in scale effort and sky attentiveness become something more mysterious still, parallel solutions arrived at independently to questions that may have been universal to human societies reaching a certain level of organisational complexity. We do not currently have the evidence to decide between these possibilities with confidence. DNA studies of Neolithic Mediterranean populations have illuminated migration patterns and population movements in broad terms, but the specific communities that built Ġgantija remain incompletely characterized. The social structures, the hierarchies or their absence, the division between those who designed and those who laboured, the relationship between the people buried near these temples and the communities that maintained them. These are questions that bones and stones can gesture toward without answering. What genetics can tell us about ancestry, it cannot yet tell us about belief. The gap between the biological and the cosmological remains as wide as it has always been. There is something that feels significant about ending here in the Mediterranean, on an island, with the oldest free-standing temples the world has preserved. Ġgantija means something close to Giant's Tower in Maltese, a name given by later inhabitants who encountered the ruins and could not imagine the builders as simply human. That naming impulse, the reach for the supernatural to explain the inexplicable, is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us that even the people who came after, who lived within sight of these walls for generations, found them beyond easy accounting. And that instinct, it turns out, has not entirely left us. We have laser scanners now. We have radiocarbon chronologies refined by Bayesian statistics. We have DNA databases and three-dimensional stress models and drone-captured photogrammetric archives. We can measure these places with extraordinary precision. We can date them, map them, virtually reconstruct them, and trace the geological origins of their stones across hundreds of kilometres. What we cannot do at any of the 7 sites visited in this survey is fully recover the system of meaning that made the effort worthwhile to the people who did the work. the engineering survives. The belief that motivated it has dissolved into silence, and perhaps that is why these places still hold such power over us. Not because they're broken mysteries waiting to be solved, but because they remind us, persistently and in stone, that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary things in the service of ideas we can no longer read.